Japanese comfort girls were shocked when British soldiers respected their privacy. August 14, 1945, 0600 hours, 12 miles northeast of Rangoon, Burma. 22-year-old Yuki Tanaka pressed herself against the bamboo wall of the corrugated metal hut, her fingers trembling as distant artillery fire shook dust from the ceiling beams. Through the gaps in the wall, she could see British armored vehicles approaching through the morning mist, their engines growling like mechanical beasts she had only heard about in whispered warnings. Beside her, 19-year-old Emiko Sato clutched a threadbare blanket to her chest, tears streaming silently down her face. Neither woman spoke. Speech seemed impossible when death felt so close. For 3 years, Yuki had survived what the Japanese officers called comfort stations, a sanitized term for systematic sexual slavery that had consumed nearly 200,000 women across Asia. The reality was far uglier than any euphemism could disguise. The previous night, their Japanese guards had fled without warning. 17 soldiers simply vanished into the jungle darkness, taking their weapons, their supplies, and any pretense of protection. They left behind 11 women, all between 18 and 24 years old, all taken from their families under false promises of factory work or nursing positions. The women had discovered too late that their real purpose was to service 50 to 60 soldiers per day, 7 days per week, with no rest except during menstruation. Now, those same abandoned women huddled together as foreign soldiers surrounded their camp. Yuki had been told by Japanese propaganda officers that British soldiers were demons who raped without mercy, who tortured prisoners for entertainment, who committed atrocities that made Japanese military discipline look humane by comparison. She had absorbed these stories during the mandatory political education sessions held every Sunday morning, when exhausted comfort girls sat through 2-hour lectures about Western barbarism while their bodies tried desperately to heal from the previous week's violence. The British vehicles stopped 50 meters from the huts. Yuki counted 6 trucks and 2 armored cars. Approximately 40 soldiers dismounted, their unfamiliar uniforms making them look alien and terrifying. They carried rifles but kept them pointed down, moving with cautious efficiency through the abandoned Japanese positions. One soldier spotted the comfort station huts and called out in heavily accented Japanese, "Women in sight. We are British Army. We will not hurt you. Please come out slowly." Yuki's heart hammered against her ribs. This had to be a trick. No conquering army announced itself politely. No soldiers promised safety to enemy civilians. She had witnessed Japanese soldiers entering Chinese villages. She knew what conquering armies did to women. The promises always came first, followed by screaming. That lasted for hours. Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today. Now back to the story. The British soldier called again, his voice patient and strangely gentle. "We have medical supplies. We have food. Please, we want to help you." Emiko looked at Yuki with desperate, questioning eyes. They had no weapons, no way to escape, nowhere to run. The jungle surrounding the camp was dense with leeches, poisonous snakes, and malaria-bearing mosquitoes. Japanese soldiers had warned them repeatedly that escape meant death, either from the jungle itself or from local villagers who had learned to hate anyone associated with the Imperial Army. "We have no choice," Yuki whispered. "If we stay hidden, they will search the huts. Better to surrender on our feet than be dragged out." She stood slowly, her legs weak from malnutrition and years of abuse. Her body weighed 42 kilograms, down from 55 when she had been taken from her village in Kyushu 3 years earlier. Every movement caused pain. Her back carried scars from beatings. Her wrists showed rope marks that had never fully healed. Yuki pushed aside the canvas that served as a door and stepped into the morning light. 10 other women followed her, their faces hollow with fear and resignation. They stood in a ragged line, waiting for the violence they knew must come. The British sergeant who approached them looked nothing like the demons from propaganda posters. Sergeant George Parker, 32 years old, moved slowly with his hands visible and empty. He stopped 3 meters away, far enough to avoid seeming threatening. His face showed exhaustion and something Yuki had not expected: sadness. "My name is Sergeant Parker," he said in careful Japanese, consulting a small phrase book. "You are prisoners of war. Geneva Convention protects you. We will not harm you." Yuki waited for the inevitable qualification, the "but" that would reveal the real conditions of their captivity. It never came. Instead, Sergeant Parker gestured to a female nurse standing beside one of the trucks. The nurse, perhaps 25 years old, with red hair tied back under her cap, approached carrying a medical bag. "This is Nurse Hannah Moore," Parker continued. "She will examine you for injuries. Only if you consent. You can refuse." The concept of consent seemed like a foreign language. For 3 years, Yuki had possessed no right to refuse anything. Japanese officers had not asked permission. They had simply taken what they wanted, when they wanted it, as many times as they wanted it. The military regulations stated clearly that comfort girls existed to maintain troop morale and prevent rape of local populations. Their bodies were military equipment, no different from rifles or ammunition. Hannah Moore smiled gently and spoke in English. Sergeant Parker translated. "She says she knows you have suffered. She wants to help, but only if you allow it." Emiko collapsed suddenly, her legs giving out. 2 British soldiers moved forward instinctively, then stopped when the women flinched backward. Hannah Moore knelt beside Emiko instead, opening her medical bag slowly, showing its contents. Bandages, medicine bottles, clean gauze. No weapons, no restraints, no instruments of torture. "She is dehydrated," Hannah said softly. "When did you last drink clean water?" Yuki tried to remember. The Japanese guards had rationed water strictly. 1 cup in the morning, 1 at night. Never enough. 2 days, she whispered in broken English, words she had learned from a Korean comfort girl who had died of pneumonia the previous winter. Hannah's face tightened with barely controlled anger. Not anger at the women, Yuki realized with shock, but anger for them. The nurse distributed canteens to each woman, encouraging them to drink slowly. The water tasted clean, free of the metallic bitterness that came from the Japanese camp's contaminated well. The British soldiers loaded the women into trucks with canvas covers, protecting them from the sun. Inside, the truck beds had been lined with blankets. Actual blankets, clean ones that did not smell of sweat and fear. Yuki sat next to Emiko, both women silent with confusion. This treatment contradicted everything they had been taught. The convoy drove for 3 hours, stopping twice to allow the women to relieve themselves in privacy. British soldiers formed a perimeter facing outward, giving the women space and dignity. This simple act of respect seemed more shocking than violence would have been. Violence, they understood. Kindness felt dangerous, like a trap they could not identify. They arrived at a British prisoner of war camp outside Rangoon at 1400 hours. The facility held approximately 800 Japanese soldiers, all captured during the final British offensive. Yuki felt terror grip her throat. If the Japanese soldiers saw her here, they would know she had survived, would know she had surrendered to the enemy. In Japanese military culture, surrender meant eternal shame. Comfort girls who survived were considered traitors to their duty. But the British had anticipated this problem. The women were taken to a separate compound, completely isolated from the main prisoner sections. Their quarters consisted of 4 wooden barracks, each with 6 beds, clean sheets, and mosquito netting. A separate washing facility offered hot water, soap, and towels. Yuki touched the soap tentatively, unable to believe such luxury existed for prisoners. Sergeant Parker addressed them through an interpreter, a Japanese-American soldier named Corporal James Tanaka. "You will not be required to work. You are victims, not criminals. Rest, eat, heal. We will protect you." That first night in the British camp, Yuki could not sleep, despite the clean mattress and quiet darkness. She lay awake, listening to Emiko's breathing in the next bed, her mind circling endlessly around a single, terrifying question. Why were they being treated this way? In 3 years as a comfort girl, Yuki had learned that kindness always had a price. Japanese officers who brought extra food expected sexual favors in return. Guards who offered medicine demanded compliance with particularly degrading requests. Nothing came free. Everything was a transaction, and women's bodies were the only currency accepted. So what did the British soldiers want? When would they reveal the real cost of clean water, soft beds, and gentle words? Yuki's stomach twisted with anticipation of inevitable violence. The waiting felt worse than the abuse itself. By dawn, she had developed a working theory. The British were softening them up, making them compliant before revealing the true nature of their captivity. It was a more sophisticated approach than Japanese brutality, but the end result would be identical. They would be used until they broke or died, whichever came first. The morning meal arrived at 0700. British soldiers carried in metal trays containing rice, vegetables, canned fruit, and tea with sugar. Actual sugar, refined and white. Something Yuki had not tasted since childhood. The rations provided roughly 2,000 calories per person, more food than comfort girls had received in a week. "This cannot last," Yuki muttered to Emiko as they ate. "They are fattening us up for something." Emiko nodded miserably. "Maybe they will sell us. I heard Korean girls talking about being sold to Chinese brothels. Maybe the British have arranged something similar." The other women harbored equally dark suspicions. Naomi Watanabe, a 20-year-old from Osaka, believed they were being prepared for medical experiments. She had heard stories about American doctors who tested new medicines on prisoners. Keiko Yamamoto thought they would be used as hostages, paraded before cameras to prove British moral superiority. Each woman's imagination created horrors based on her own experiences. At 900 hours, Hannah Moore arrived to conduct medical examinations. She brought another nurse, Elizabeth Chen, a Chinese woman who spoke fluent Japanese. Elizabeth explained the examination process carefully, emphasizing that everything was voluntary, that the women could refuse any procedure, that they controlled what happened to their own bodies. Yuki agreed to the examination because refusal seemed more dangerous than compliance. Hannah worked with gentle efficiency, documenting injuries that made her hands shake with suppressed rage. Fractured ribs that had healed incorrectly, vaginal scarring consistent with repeated trauma, malnutrition so severe that Yuki's menstruation had stopped 18 months earlier, evidence of untreated sexually transmitted infections, burns from cigarettes used as punishment or entertainment. "I am so sorry," Hannah whispered, tears visible in her eyes. "I am so sorry this happened to you." Yuki stared at her in confusion. Why would a British nurse apologize for Japanese crimes? It made no sense within any framework Yuki understood. Perpetrators did not apologize. Victims apologized. That was how power worked. The strong took what they wanted, and the weak said thank you for their survival. Over the following days, Yuki watched obsessively for signs of the trap's true nature. She noted how Sergeant Parker always maintained appropriate distance from the women, how British soldiers knocked before entering the barracks, waiting for permission, how meals arrived on schedule without any demands for reciprocation, how Hannah treated infected wounds without requiring payment. August 22nd, 1945, 1700 hours. Yuki sat alone on the barracks steps, watching the sunset over distant mountains. 8 days had passed since capture. 8 days without sexual assault, without beatings, without demands that she service soldiers until her body gave out completely. The absence of violence felt more disturbing than violence itself. Her mind kept insisting this peace was temporary, that the real horror would begin any moment. Sergeant Parker approached slowly, making noise to avoid startling her. He carried a small canvas bag and wore the careful expression of someone approaching a frightened animal. Yuki tensed, preparing for whatever would come next. "Miss Tanaka," he said, through Corporal Tanaka's translation, "I have brought some items that might be useful. You may refuse them if you wish." He opened the bag carefully, showing its contents from a distance. A comb, toothbrush, toothpaste, small mirror, bar of soap, face cream, sanitary napkins. All new, all still in packaging. Items that suggested someone had thought carefully about what a woman might need. "These are yours," Parker said. "No payment required, no obligation attached." Yuki accepted the bag with trembling hands, unable to speak. The sanitary napkins particularly shocked her. For 3 years, Comfort Girls had used rags they washed and reused, never clean, always causing infections. The Japanese military had not considered menstrual supplies worth purchasing. Women were expected to work through their periods, blood and all, unless they paid for cloth from their minuscule wages. "There is one more thing," Parker continued. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I wrote to the International Red Cross about your situation. They are sending representatives to interview you and the other women. Whatever you tell them will be documented. The world will know what happened." Yuki looked at him with incomprehension. Why would anyone care what happened to Comfort Girls? They were the lowest of the low, women who had allowed themselves to be used, who had survived when they should have chosen death. Japanese society would never accept them back. Their families would pretend they had died honorably, rather than acknowledge the truth. "Nobody will believe us," Yuki said quietly. "We are prostitutes. Our word means nothing." Parker's face hardened. "You are not prostitutes. You are victims of war crimes. There is a difference, and that difference matters." He stood to leave, then paused. "Miss Tanaka, I have a sister about your age. If someone had done to her what was done to you, I would want her to know that the men who hurt her were criminals, that she did nothing wrong, that she deserves kindness." After he left, Yuki clutched the canvas bag and cried for the first time since her capture by Japanese military police 3 years earlier. She had taught herself not to cry, because tears made the soldiers laugh, made them hurt her more deliberately. But here, alone in the fading light, she allowed herself to feel something besides fear and numbness. The emotion was so unfamiliar, she could barely name it. Hope, perhaps, or the beginning of it. That evening, Emiko found Yuki washing her hair with the new soap, working carefully through tangles that had accumulated from months of neglect. The barracks had a proper washing room, with mirrors and running water, luxuries that felt almost obscene after years of filth. "Hannah gave me books," Eniko said softly. "English books, with pictures. She said I could learn to read them if I wanted. That she would teach me." The two women looked at each other, both struggling with the same impossible question. What if the British soldiers meant exactly what they said? What if there was no hidden trap, no coming revelation of cruelty? What if these men genuinely wanted to help? The possibility seemed more terrifying than any violence. September 1st, 1945, 0300 hours. Yuki woke screaming, her sheets soaked with sweat, the nightmare still vivid behind her eyes. In the dream, she was back in the comfort station. A Japanese colonel was using her body while other soldiers waited their turn, smoking cigarettes and discussing baseball scores. She could smell the officer's sake breath, feel his weight crushing her ribs, hear his grunts of satisfaction that meant the ordeal would soon end. Except it never ended. In the dream, the line of waiting soldiers stretched infinitely. She serviced 50 men, then 50 more, then 50 more again. Her body tore and bled, but the soldiers kept coming, kept using her, kept reducing her to nothing but a warm hole for their pleasure. Hannah Moore appeared in the doorway within 30 seconds, carrying a lantern and her medical bag. She had been sleeping in a small room attached to the women's barracks, close enough to respond to nightmares that occurred nightly among the comfort girls. "It's all right," Hannah said softly. "You're safe. You're in the British camp. Nobody is hurting you." Yuki's breathing gradually slowed. She looked around the barracks, confirming reality. Clean beds, mosquito netting, other women sleeping peacefully. No soldiers, no violence. Just a nightmare. Nothing more. "They come every night," Yuki whispered in halting English words she was slowly learning. "The dreams, always the same." Hannah sat on the edge of the bed, careful to maintain distance. "Your mind is trying to process trauma. It's normal. It will take time." But time felt like a luxury Yuki could not afford. Every day in the camp, her confusion deepened. The British soldiers maintained their careful respect. Meals arrived with regularity. Medical treatment continued without demands for payment. Nobody touched the women without explicit permission. The cognitive dissonance created a different kind of pain, a psychological wound that might never heal. How could she reconcile 3 years of systematic brutality with 2 weeks of gentle care? Which experience represented truth about human nature? The Japanese officers who had used her body as military equipment, or the British soldiers who treated her as a person deserving of dignity? At breakfast, Yuki noticed Naomi picking at her food without eating. The older woman had been withdrawing steadily, speaking less each day, her eyes acquiring the hollow look that Yuki recognized from comfort girls who had given up on survival. 3 women at Yuki's previous station had chosen that path, hanging themselves with torn sheets when guards were not watching. The Japanese military had punished the other comfort girls for those deaths, reducing rations and increasing work quotas as collective punishment. "Naomi," Yuki said quietly, "you need to eat." "Why?" Naomi's voice was flat, emotionless. "So I can live longer? For what purpose?" Hannah, overhearing, sat down across from Naomi. Elizabeth Chen joined her, ready to translate. "You live because your life has value," Hannah said firmly. "Because you survived something terrible, and that survival matters. Because the men who hurt you don't get to win." Naomi laughed bitterly. "They already won. Look at us. We are broken. We will never be wives, never have normal families, never be accepted by our own people. We are ruined women. Better to die than face the shame. The conversation revealed a truth that none of the British soldiers had fully understood. The trauma was not just physical or even psychological. It was cultural, woven into Japanese concepts of honor, shame, and feminine purity. These women had been taught from childhood that a woman's value resided in her virginity and virtue. Comfort girls possessed neither. They were living embodiments of shame, their very existence a violation of everything their culture held sacred. That afternoon, Corporal Robert Sullivan, a 40-year-old soldier with graying hair and kind eyes, brought a box of books to the women's barracks. He had served in Burma for 3 years and spoke adequate Japanese learned from working with local translators. "I thought you might enjoy reading," Sullivan said. "These are from our library. Poetry, novels, histories, whatever interests you." Yuki examined the books carefully. Most were in English, but several had been translated into Japanese. Pulled out a slim volume of English poetry, its pages worn from many readings. Sullivan had written his name inside the cover in careful script. "This is yours," Yuki said. "Why give it away?" Sullivan smiled. "Because I have read it many times. Because you might find some comfort in it. Because books remind us that beauty exists even in the worst circumstances." He opened to a marked page and read aloud in English, then translated haltingly into Japanese. The poem described a soldier returning home from war, finding peace in ordinary things. Gardens, rainfall, his children's laughter. The simple miracle of survival. For the first time since her capture, Yuki felt something besides fear and confusion. She felt curiosity. The poem suggested that trauma could be survived, that normal life might exist on the other side of horror. The possibility seemed impossibly distant, but Sullivan's scarred face and gentle manner suggested he had walked that path himself. September 8th, 1945, 1400 hours. The recreation area behind the women's barracks had been transformed over the past week. British soldiers had built wooden benches under canvas awnings, providing shade from the brutal Burmese sun. They had brought folding tables, decks of cards, and board games from their own supplies. The space resembled a park more than a prison compound. Sergeant Parker approached Yuki and Emiko carrying a wooden box inlaid with alternating light and dark squares. He set it on the table between them with careful reverence, as if presenting something precious. "This is chess," he said through Corporal Tanaka's translation. "A game of strategy. Would you like to learn?" Yuki studied the board suspiciously. In her experience, soldiers who offered to teach women things expected payment in the form of sexual favors. The lesson always came with strings attached, invisible until it was too late to refuse. But Parker simply opened the box and began arranging pieces on the board. He explained the rules slowly, demonstrating how each piece moved. The pawn could only step forward. The knight moved in an unusual L shape. The queen commanded the most power, able to strike in any direction. "The goal is to protect your king while threatening your opponents," Parker explained. "It requires thinking several moves ahead, anticipating what your opponent might do." For the next hour, Parker taught them the basic strategies. He played against himself to demonstrate tactics, narrating his thinking process. When Yuki made her first move, Parker nodded approvingly. When she made a mistake, he gently explained why without criticism or mockery. The game itself was less important than what it represented. Parker was treating them as human beings, capable of learning complex skills. He was giving them his time without expecting anything in return. He was speaking to them as equals rather than as objects to be used. Emiko captured one of Parker's pawns and smiled. It was the first genuine smile Yuki had seen on her friend's face in 3 years. The expression transformed Emiko from a broken comfort girl into a 19-year-old woman discovering joy in a simple game. That evening, Hannah Moore brought Emiko to the camp's small library. The room held perhaps 300 books, mostly in English, but with some Japanese volumes acquired from captured officers. The books sat on shelves built by British carpenters, organized by subject and author. "You can borrow any book you wish," Hannah said. "Keep it as long as you need. We have time." Emiko ran her fingers along the spines, reading titles in wonder. She had completed 6 years of schooling before being taken by Japanese military police. She could read basic Japanese, but had never owned a book of her own. Books were expensive luxuries reserved for wealthy families. Hannah pulled a volume from the shelf. "This one has illustrations. It's about English gardens. I thought you might enjoy the pictures, even if the words are difficult." The book showed photographs of roses, lavender, and flowering trees. Gardens where nothing violent had ever occurred, where beauty existed simply for its own sake. Emiko clutched the book like a treasure, tears streaming down her face. "Why are you kind to us?" she whispered. "We are nothing. We are ruined women." Hannah knelt to meet Emiko's eyes. "You are not nothing. You are survivors. You are brave. You are deserving of every kindness." September 10th brought another unexpected gift. Corporal Sullivan appeared at the barracks carrying a sheaf of papers covered in careful handwriting. He had copied several poems by hand, translating them into Japanese with help from Corporal Tanaka. "I thought you might like these," Sullivan said. "Poetry helped me survive Burma. Maybe it can help you too." He read one aloud, first in English, then in halting Japanese. The poem described a soldier watching the dawn after a terrible battle, seeing the sun rise despite the horror, finding hope in the simple fact of another day. Sullivan's voice cracked with emotion as he read. His hands trembled slightly, revealing his own unhealed wounds. This man, who had fought through 3 years of jungle warfare, who had witnessed atrocities that would haunt him forever, was sharing his pain with women he barely knew. "Beauty exists," Sullivan said quietly, "even in the worst places, even in the darkest times. We just have to remember to look for it." Yuki accepted the copied poems, studying Sullivan's careful handwriting. Each character had been formed with precision and care. He had spent hours on this task, translating poetry for women who had been taught they deserved nothing but suffering. That night, Yuki read the poems by lamplight. One verse particularly resonated. It spoke of broken things that could be mended, of scars that told stories of survival rather than shame, of finding strength in having endured the unsurvivable. For the first time since her capture by Japanese military police 3 years earlier, Yuki allowed herself to imagine a future. Not just survival, but actual life. The possibility remained distant and fragile, like a candle flame in the wind. But it existed. The chess pieces on the table, the book of gardens in Emiko's hands, the poems copied with care. These small gestures were rebuilding something the Japanese military had systematically destroyed. They were restoring the women's humanity, one tiny act at a time. September 16th, 1945, 0800 hours. The sound of military trucks arriving shattered the fragile peace. Yuki stood at the barracks window watching as British soldiers unloaded approximately 60 Japanese prisoners of war, all captured during recent fighting near Mulmine. The men wore tattered Imperial Army uniforms, their faces showing the defeat Japan had refused to acknowledge officially. Terror gripped Yuki's throat. Some of those men might recognize her, might remember her face from the comfort station, might report to Japanese authorities after repatriation that she had survived, had surrendered, had collaborated with the enemy by accepting British kindness. In Japanese military culture, comfort girls who survived were considered traitors twice over. First, they had failed their duty by not dying to preserve their honor. Second, they had accepted life under enemy control rather than choosing suicide. Their families would be shamed. Their names would be struck from family registers. They would become non-persons, ghosts without identity or place. Emiko grabbed Yuki's arm, her fingernails digging into skin. "They will see us. They will know." "The British separated the compounds," Yuki said, trying to convince herself. "We are isolated. They cannot reach us." But isolation meant nothing if Japanese prisoners reported their presence through official channels. The Comfort Women system was technically classified, never openly acknowledged by Tokyo. But everyone in the Imperial Army knew it existed. Officers had discussed it casually while waiting their turns, debating which comfort station had the best girls, which ones provided extra services for additional payment. By noon, tension had infected all 11 women in the compound. Naomi sat rocking silently, her arms wrapped around her knees. Keiko vomited repeatedly, unable to keep down her breakfast. Two younger women, Hana and Sachiko, both only 18 years old, clung to each other and cried. Hannah Moore tried to provide comfort, but she could not understand the specific cultural shame consuming these women. Western concepts of victimhood did not translate to Japanese ideas about honor and female purity. A British woman who survived rape remained a victim deserving of sympathy. A Japanese woman who survived sexual slavery became contaminated goods, permanently unmarriageable, forever shamed. At 1400 hours, the situation escalated. Captain Edward Fitzpatrick, senior British officer in the camp, summoned Sergeant Parker and several other soldiers to the main administration building. Corporal Tanaka, pulled into the meeting as translator, returned to the women's compound at 1600 hours with his face tight with suppressed anger. "The Japanese prisoners are demanding to know why women are held here," Tanaka explained. "They claim it violates the separation of sexes required by military regulations. They want the women transferred to a Japanese civilian internment camp." Yuki's vision narrowed. Transfer to a civilian camp meant being placed under Japanese authority, meant facing interrogation about how they had survived, what they had told the British, whether they had provided intelligence to the enemy. The Japanese prisoners were not protecting the women. They were trying to silence them. Captain Fitzpatrick refused their demand, Tanaka continued. He stated clearly that you are protected under the Geneva Convention as victims of war crimes, that you will remain under British custody until repatriation can be arranged safely. "What happens if they insist?" Yuki asked. The captain was very clear about that, too. He told the Japanese commander that any attempt to interfere with your safety would be considered a hostile act. That evening, voices rose from the direction of the main camp. Yuki could hear shouting in Japanese. Angry demands met with calm British refusals. The confrontation lasted nearly an hour before military police restored order. September 17th, 1945, 0900 hours. Captain Fitzpatrick himself came to the women's compound, his face showing both exhaustion and determination. He had been awake most of the night, dealing with the Japanese prisoners' increasingly aggressive demands. Through Corporal Tanaka, Fitzpatrick addressed all 11 women gathered in the main barracks. His words would prove to be the turning point that finally shattered their fear. Last night, the ranking Japanese officer demanded your immediate transfer to his authority, Fitzpatrick began. He claimed you were Japanese citizens who should be under Japanese protection. He insisted that British custody of Japanese women was inappropriate. Yuki felt her stomach drop. This was the moment the trap revealed itself. The British had been kind because they needed cooperation, but ultimately military necessity would override humanitarian concern. They would hand the women over to Japanese authority to avoid diplomatic complications. I told him to go to hell, Fitzpatrick said flatly. The bluntness of his response, even filtered through translation, shocked everyone silent. Fitzpatrick continued, his voice hard with conviction. I informed the Japanese commander that you are not comfort girls. You are victims of systematic sexual slavery. That under the Geneva Convention, victims of war crimes are entitled to protection from their abusers. That His Majesty's government does not return victims to their torturers for administrative convenience. He paused, letting the words sink in. The Japanese officer claimed your presence here was voluntary, that you chose to work as comfort girls, that you are merely prostitutes seeking better conditions. Yuki's face burned with shame. This was how it would be described, how it would always be described. Women who had been dragged from their homes by military police would be labeled voluntary participants. Teenagers forced to serve as 50 soldiers daily would be called prostitutes who chose their profession. I showed him your medical records, Fitzpatrick said. Dr. Moore's documentation of your injuries. The evidence of systematic trauma, malnutrition, and abuse. I explained in very specific terms what those injuries indicate, how they prove sustained sexual violence over extended periods. The captain's voice roughened with barely contained rage. I told him that any nation that treats women this way has forfeited its right to claim moral authority. That Japan's conduct regarding comfort women will be investigated as war crimes. That documentation is being prepared for international tribunals. Yuki stared at him in disbelief. A British officer was defending comfort girls against Japanese military authorities, was publicly stating that the comfort system constituted war crimes, was willing to create diplomatic friction to protect women that Japanese society considered disposable. The Japanese commander demanded to know under what authority I made these claims, Fitzpatrick continued. I cited Article 3 of the Geneva Convention, articles regarding treatment of non-combatants, regulations governing protection of civilians in occupied territories, international law that Japan signed but apparently never bothered to read. He looked at each woman directly. You will not be transferred to Japanese custody. You will remain under British protection until safe repatriation can be arranged. If any Japanese prisoner attempts to contact you or threaten you, they will face punishment under British military justice. That is not a request. That is an order I am prepared to enforce. For Yuki, something fundamental shifted in that moment. Fitzpatrick was not being kind for strategic purposes. He was genuinely angry on their behalf. He believed they deserved protection and was willing to fight his own command structure to provide it. After Fitzpatrick left, Yuki found herself crying again. But these tears were different from the desperate weeping of previous days. These tears contained something unexpected. Relief. Gratitude. The beginning of trust. He called us victims, not prostitutes, Emiko whispered. He said Japan committed crimes against us. He used his authority to protect us, Naomi added, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Even though we are nothing. Even though we are enemy nationals. That afternoon, word spread through the women's compound about another confrontation. The Japanese commander had appealed to higher British authority, trying to circumvent Fitzpatrick. The response from British headquarters in Rangoon had been swift and unambiguous. The women would remain under Captain Fitzpatrick's protection. Their safety was non-negotiable. September 22nd, 1945, 0300 hours. Emiko's fever had spiked to 40 degrees Celsius. She lay on her cot shivering despite 3 blankets, her skin burning to the touch. Hannah Moore worked frantically, sponging Emiko's forehead with cool water, checking her pulse every few minutes. "It's malaria," Hannah said grimly. "Probably contracted before capture. Her immune system is too compromised to fight it properly." Yuki held Emiko's hand, feeling helpless. She had watched comfort girls die of disease before. The Japanese military had provided no medical care beyond basic antiseptics. Women who became too sick to work were simply removed from the comfort station. Nobody asked what happened to them afterward. "Will she die?" Yuki asked. "Not if I can help it," Hannah replied. She loaded a syringe with quinine, the anti-malarial drug that had saved countless Allied soldiers. "But she needs constant monitoring. The next 48 hours are critical." Sergeant Parker appeared at 0400, having been summoned from his barracks. He assessed the situation quickly, then did something that shocked everyone present. He pulled up a chair beside Emiko's bed and sat down. "I will stay with her," he said simply. "You have duties," Hannah protested. "You need sleep." "My duty is here," Parker replied. "She should not be alone." For the next 2 days, Parker maintained his vigil. He helped Hannah change Emiko's sweat-soaked sheets. He brought water when Emiko was lucid enough to drink. He read aloud from books in English, his voice providing comfort even when Emiko could not understand the words. During Emiko's worst moments, when fever dreams made her cry out in terror, Parker held her hand and spoke softly in broken Japanese, telling her she was safe. Yuki watched this with growing amazement. Parker had no tactical reason to care whether one Japanese comfort girl lived or died. His presence served no military purpose. He was simply being human, offering compassion to someone suffering. On the second night, when Emiko's fever finally broke, Parker helped Hannah give her small sips of broth. Emiko's eyes focused on his face, registering his presence for the first time in days. "Why?" she whispered in halting English. "Why you stay?" Parker considered the question carefully before answering. "Because you matter. Because leaving you alone would have been wrong. Because sometimes the only thing we can do is sit with someone in their pain." After Parker finally left to sleep, Yuki sat with the recovering Emiko. Her friend looked impossibly fragile, her weight down to perhaps 35 kilograms. But her eyes held something they had, not contained before. Hope. "The sergeant stayed for 2 days, Emiko said. "He had no reason. I am nothing to him." "You are not nothing," Yuki replied, echoing Hannah's earlier words. "The British see us as human beings." The realization settled over Yuki like a physical weight. For 3 years, she had survived by accepting that she was an object, a tool, a warm body for soldiers to use. Accepting objectification had made the daily horror slightly more bearable. But the British refused to treat her as an object. They insisted on treating her as a person. And that insistence was destroying the walls she had built to protect herself. September 25th brought Yuki to her own breaking point. Corporal Sullivan found her sitting alone near the compound fence, staring at nothing. He sat down nearby, maintaining respectful distance, and said nothing for several minutes. "My daughter is about your age," Sullivan finally said. 21. She works in a munitions factory in Birmingham. When I think about her, I think about what would happen if someone hurt her the way you were hurt. Yuki turned to look at him, surprised by his directness. "I would want her to know it was not her fault," Sullivan continued. "That surviving was not shameful, that she deserved kindness. Do you understand what I am saying?" The walls cracked, then shattered completely. September 25th, 1945, 1700 hours. Yuki began speaking. Once she started, the words poured out like water from a broken dam. She told Sullivan everything. About being taken from her village in Kyushu by military police who claimed she was needed for factory work. About arriving at the comfort station and discovering the horrifying truth. About being forced to service 50 to 60 soldiers daily, sometimes more during weekends when the troops had leave. Sullivan listened without interrupting, his face growing harder with each detail. When Yuki described the pricing system, how soldiers paid different amounts based on rank and time allotted, his hands clenched into fists. When she explained how comfort girls were punished for becoming pregnant or contracting diseases, his jaw muscles worked with suppressed rage. "Officers paid 2 yen for 30 minutes, Yuki said, her voice mechanical. Enlisted men paid 1 yen for 15 minutes. We worked from noon to midnight every day except Sundays. On Sundays, we worked from 9 in the morning to midnight. The station manager kept 80% of the payment. We received 20%, but it was credited to our accounts. We never saw the actual money." "How much debt did you supposedly owe?" Sullivan asked. 500 yen. For transportation to the station, for our room, for our food. The debt never decreased, no matter how many soldiers we serviced. The manager added new charges constantly. Replacement sheets, medicine, soap. Everything had a price, and the price always exceeded our earnings. Sullivan closed his eyes briefly, processing the systematic nature of the exploitation. It was slavery disguised as prostitution. "Yes," Yuki whispered, "but no one called it that. The officer said we were patriotic women serving the empire, contributing to the war effort, maintaining troop morale, preventing rape of local populations. We were told we should be proud of our service." She described the worst parts. The soldiers who were deliberately cruel. The officers who treated comfort girls as less than human. The medical examinations where army doctors checked them for disease weekly, but provided no actual treatment. The forced injections that were supposed to prevent pregnancy, but often made the women violently ill. One girl, Akiko, became pregnant despite the injections, Yuki said. The station manager took her away. She never came back. We heard later that pregnant comfort girls were transferred to special facilities. Nobody knew what happened there. Sullivan's face had gone pale. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "This was not war. This was industrialized rape." "The British do not do this?" Yuki asked. "Your soldiers do not have comfort stations?" "No," Sullivan said emphatically. "British soldiers who rape civilians face court-martial, military justice, prison, or execution. Rape is a crime, not a service to be purchased." This revelation struck Yuki with physical force. She had assumed all armies treated women this way, that comfort systems were universal military practice, differing only in details. The idea that some nations prohibited what others institutionalized seemed impossible. Then why did Japanese propaganda say British soldiers were monsters? Yuki asked. We were told you committed terrible atrocities, that surrender meant death or torture. Propaganda is designed to make soldiers fight harder, Sullivan explained, to prevent surrender. Both sides lie, but there are different kinds of lies. Japan lied to make you fear us. Britain lied to make us hate the enemy. But we did not create a system of sexual slavery and call it patriotic service. That evening, Yuki spoke to the group of 11 women. For the first time, she voiced what they had all been thinking, but were afraid to say aloud. The British are not our enemies, Yuki said. Our enemies were the men who created the comfort system, who took us from our families, who reduced us to objects. The British are trying to give us back our humanity. Naomi, who had been silent and withdrawn for weeks, spoke up. If we accept this, if we believe the British are good, then we must accept that our own people were evil. How do we live with that knowledge? I do not know, Yuki admitted. But I know that Sergeant Parker sat with Emiko for 2 days. I know that Captain Fitzpatrick risked diplomatic problems to protect us. I know that Hannah treats our wounds with tears in her eyes. These are not the actions of evil people. The conversation continued for hours. Each woman shared her own observations about British kindness. The small gestures that had accumulated over weeks, the consistent respect that never wavered, the genuine concern that seemed to come without expectation of reward. By midnight, something had shifted in the compound. The women had made a collective choice to trust, to believe that kindness could exist without ulterior motives, to accept that they deserved compassion simply because they were human beings who had suffered. It was not complete healing. Trauma that deep could not be resolved in a few weeks. But it was the beginning of healing, the foundation upon which recovery might eventually be built. The British soldiers had offered mercy. The Japanese comfort girls had finally chosen to accept it. October 1st, 1945, 900 hours. The news arrived by telegram from British headquarters in Singapore. Japan had formally surrendered on September 2nd. The war was officially over. Repatriation procedures for Japanese civilians would begin within 6 weeks. Yuki stood in the compound yard holding the translated announcement, her emotions a confused mixture of relief and fear. Return to Japan meant facing a society that would never accept her. Comfort girls who survived were considered shameful reminders of a war Japan wanted to forget. Her family might refuse to acknowledge her existence. Her name would be stricken from the family register. She would become a ghost woman, legally and socially dead. But staying in Burma under British protection was impossible. The war had ended. The prisoners of war camps would be dismantled. The women had no legal status that would allow them to remain in British-controlled territory. Sergeant Parker found her that afternoon, sitting alone near the compound fence. He carried 2 cups of tea, offering one to her in the gesture that had become familiar over the past weeks. They sat in companionable silence for several minutes before he spoke. "You are afraid to go home," Parker said. It was not a question. "Japan does not want us," Yuki replied. "We are evidence of shame. Better if we had died." Parker's jaw tightened. "You survived something that should have killed you. That is not shameful. That is extraordinary." "In your culture, perhaps. In mine, survival without honor is worse than death." "Then your culture is wrong," Parker said bluntly. "And I think you know that now." Yuki looked at him in surprise. The directness of his statement was shocking, but he was right. The past 6 weeks had taught her that Japanese military culture was built on lies. Honor did not mean accepting abuse without complaint. Duty did not require destroying yourself for men who saw you as disposable. The entire moral framework she had been taught was designed to make victims complicit in their own exploitation. "What will you do when you return?" Parker asked.
"I do not know. Find work, if anyone will employ me. Hide my past, if possible."
She paused, then added something she had not voiced before. "Help other women if I can, ones who survived like I did." Parker nodded slowly. That would be good work. Important work. Over the following days, Yuki watched the British soldiers prepare the women for repatriation with the same care they had shown throughout their captivity. Hannah Moore taught them basic first aid skills they could use to help themselves and others. Corporal Sullivan helped them compose letters to their families, explaining their circumstances in ways that might minimize shame. Captain Fitzpatrick wrote detailed documentation of their captivity, sealed letters they could present to Japanese authorities if needed. On October 8th, the Red Cross representatives arrived to interview the women. The British had arranged this specifically to create an official record of the comfort system. Each woman spoke privately with the interviewers, describing their experiences in detail. The interviews lasted 3 days. The documentation filled 200 pages. "Your testimony will be preserved," the lead investigator told them. "What happened to you was a war crime. History will record that. Future generations will know the truth." October 15th brought the final gathering of all 11 women and the British soldiers who had cared for them. Captain Fitzpatrick addressed the group formally, his usual stern demeanor softened by genuine emotion. "You came to us as prisoners," Fitzpatrick said. "You leave as survivors. That distinction matters. You have endured horrors that most people cannot imagine. You have shown courage that deserves recognition. We have tried to treat you with the dignity you were denied. I hope we have succeeded." Yuki stood, her legs trembling. She had prepared words in English, practicing them with Hannah's help. "You showed us that kindness exists, that not all soldiers are cruel, that we deserve respect simply because we are human beings. We will never forget this." For the first time in 3 years, Yuki smiled. A genuine smile that reached her eyes. She looked at Sergeant Parker and saw tears on his face. This hardened soldier, who had fought through 3 years of jungle warfare, was crying for 11 Japanese women he would never see again. The British soldiers had given them something more precious than food or medicine. They had given them back their humanity. That gift would prove impossible to destroy. March 7th, 1953, 1400 hours, Tokyo, Japan. Yuki Tanaka, now 30 years old, stood before a small gathering of women in a borrowed meeting room above a noodle shop in the Shinjuku district. 16 women sat on folding chairs, their ages ranging from 23 to 45. All were former comfort girls. All had survived. "My name is Yuki Tanaka," she began in Japanese. "In 1942, I was taken from my village by military police. I was told I would work in a factory. Instead, I was forced into sexual slavery for 3 years. I survived." "And I am here to tell you that survival is not shameful. It is victory." The organization she had founded, which she called simply the Survivors Circle, had grown from 3 women meeting secretly in her one-room apartment to this gathering of 16. The work was dangerous. Japanese society in 1953 still refused to acknowledge the comfort women system officially. Former comfort girls were expected to hide their pasts, change their names, pretend the abuse never happened. But Yuki remembered what Captain Fitzpatrick had told her. What happened to you was a war crime. History will record that. She was determined to ensure history remembered correctly, even if the present preferred to forget. The Survivors Circle provided practical assistance, help finding employment that did not require family references, medical care from sympathetic doctors who asked no questions about past trauma, legal advice for women whose families had disowned them, safe housing for those who had nowhere else to go. Most importantly, it provided community, a place where former comfort girls could speak truth without shame. The British soldiers who captured me taught me something crucial, Yuki told the gathered women. They taught me that my value as a human being was not determined by what was done to me, that I deserved kindness simply because I existed, that I had nothing to be ashamed of. She described her 6 weeks in the British prisoner of war camp, the respect shown by Sergeant Parker, the medical care from Hannah Moore, the poetry from Corporal Sullivan, the protection provided by Captain Fitzpatrick. Each detail contradicted everything Japanese propaganda had taught about Western brutality. They treated us better than our own military did, Yuki said. That truth is uncomfortable for many Japanese to accept, but accepting uncomfortable truths is how we heal. The work was slow and often discouraging. Japanese society was not ready to acknowledge what had been done to comfort women. The government denied the system had involved coercion. Military veterans claimed the women had volunteered. Conservative groups insisted that discussing the comfort system damaged Japan's honor. But Yuki persisted. She had survived 3 years of systematic rape. She had endured malnutrition, disease, and brutality that killed countless other women. She had lived through the shame of returning to a country that considered her existence embarrassing. She would not be silenced by people who preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. In 1956, a British journalist visiting Tokyo heard about the Survivors Circle and requested an interview. Yuki agreed. The resulting article, published in the London Times, included her photograph and detailed testimony. The article mentioned Sergeant George Parker by name, describing how his kindness had helped Yuki survive psychologically. 2 months later, a letter arrived from England. Parker had read the article. He was now 44 years old, married with 2 children, working as a carpenter in Manchester. He wrote that seeing Yuki's photograph, seeing her smiling and strong, had moved him to tears. That knowing she had survived and was helping others made his service in Burma feel meaningful. "You taught me something too," Parker wrote. "You taught me that even in the worst circumstances, human dignity can be preserved if someone is willing to recognize it. Thank you for surviving. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for refusing to let them win." Yuki kept that letter for the rest of her life. She read it whenever the work felt hopeless, whenever Japanese society's denial felt overwhelming, whenever she questioned whether one woman could make any difference. By 1975, the Survivors Circle had helped over 300 former comfort women. The organization had grown to include counselors, lawyers, and doctors. They operated openly, no longer hiding from social disapproval. Japanese attitudes were slowly changing as younger generations questioned wartime narratives. Yuki lived to see the 1990s, when former comfort women across Asia began speaking publicly about their experiences. When international pressure forced partial Japanese acknowledgement of the system's coercive nature. When memorials were built and apologies were issued, however inadequate. She died in 2003 at age 80. Her obituary in the Asahi Shimbun described her as a pioneer advocate for comfort women survivors. It mentioned her captivity by British forces in Burma. It noted that British soldiers' compassionate treatment had inspired her life's work. The final line of the obituary quoted Yuki from a 2001 interview. "Sergeant Parker and the others showed me that kindness can exist even in war. That mercy is not weakness, but strength. That recognizing another person's humanity costs nothing but fear. Those lessons saved my life. I spent 60 years trying to pass them on." The lessons endured. The Survivors Circle continued its work long after Yuki's death. The documentation she had preserved, including the sealed letters from Captain Fitzpatrick, became historical evidence used by researchers and activists. Her testimony appeared in books, documentaries, and educational materials about World War II. Sergeant George Parker died in 2005 in Manchester. His family, reading through his effects, found a worn photograph of 11 Japanese women standing with British soldiers outside barracks in Burma. On the back, in Parker's handwriting, "Burma, October 1945. Proof that mercy matters." The photograph now sits in the Imperial War Museum in London. Next to it is a display panel explaining the Comfort Women's system, explaining how British soldiers in Burma treated these victims with unprecedented dignity, explaining how that dignity transformed lives and inspired decades of advocacy. The story of Yuki, Tanaka, and Sergeant George Parker reminds us that even in humanity's darkest moments, compassion can break through, that kindness offered to enemies can echo across generations, that treating people with dignity, regardless of circumstances, is never wasted effort. In 1945, 11 Japanese comfort girls expected death or continued brutality from their British captors. Instead, they found mercy. That mercy changed them. They carried it home and used it to change others. The ripples continue spreading, reminding us that the greatest victories are sometimes won not through violence, but through the simple, revolutionary act of recognizing another human being's worth. I hope you like this story. Please share what's your favorite part of the story and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.